Welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be exploring the SAP BPC roadmap. We're delighted to have you join us. My name's Carrie and I'll be your host for this session. So if I just quickly give you an overview of the agenda. Firstly, I'll introduce our two speakers. Then we'll share some key facts and dates to be aware of. Give an outline of the various options if you are currently using SAP BPC. We'll share some guidance on evaluating whether BPC is still the right strategy for you, and then we'll answer any questions at the end. So I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers. They are both long-standing industry leaders. We have David Watson and Simon Bell. Between them, they've amassed over 60 years of experience in the EPM space, and they're also both founders of highly successful EPM consulting firms. David is the Managing Director of Concentric Solutions. He started his career at Hyperion Solutions, and for the past 20 years, he's been one of the leaders of Concentric, an EPM consultancy specializing in Oracle, OneStream, and LoopNet, and also SAP through our subsidiary InsightCubes Europe. InsightCubes brings SAP DataSphere and technical capabilities, as well as expertise in SAP, BPC, SAC, and group reporting. As the first OneStream partner in Europe, David has led Concentric in some cutting-edge solutions spanning financial consolidation, planning and reporting, ESG reporting, and also the developing AI and machine learning domains. With customers such as First Group, GKN, Pladis, Tata Steel, Concentric has established itself as a leader in the EPM solutions space. Simon is Managing Director of SAP BPC. In 2008, he founded Opalwave Solutions, which became the foremost EPM consultancy specializing in SAP. When Opalwave was sold to Sapphire Systems in 2023, Simon continued to manage and advise until 2024. He developed packaged capabilities for planning and consolidation, and these were deployed into more than 30 of Sapphire's customers over an 18-month period. Before becoming a leader in enterprise performance management, Simon began working as an accountant, developing statistically derived planning models. He also worked at Hyperion and led the European arm of BPM Partners. Over the course of his career, Simon has helped organizations around the world such as IKEA, Sony PlayStation, AGCO, and Moët Hennessy. In his latest role, Simon is now leading SAP BPC with former Opalwave colleague Sham Khan, providing best practice guidance to businesses across Europe and the USA in the next stage of their EPM journeys. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David to get us started.
Thank you, Carrie. First of all, I'd like to say a very warm welcome and thank you to you all for making the time to join us this afternoon. Before I hand off and introduce Simon, I'd just like to say a few words about the background to us hosting this webinar. A little later this year, Concentric will be celebrating 20 years in business, specifically focused on the EPM and data analytics space. I think it's worth us reflecting on what's changed in that time. And I think if I reflect on where I started, we were in a world where we had a legacy of point solutions that addressed financial close, budgeting and planning, tax reporting, account reconciliations. They were all standalone technologies. And then we moved to a period where SAP, Oracle, IBM, and other similar organizations started acquiring the point solution vendors and creating suites of EPM technologies. And then after that, we moved to there was a trend towards moving to on-premise EPM platforms, moving away from individual point solution technologies into solutions that were designed first and foremost to operate in an integrated way as a platform. And then with the advent of more recent players in the market, we've seen a big shift into the cloud with cloud-based EPM platforms. Now, over that time, there's normal vendor life cycles that take place. And I think what we've found in the past is we've run webinars and seminars of this predominantly off the back of the fact there's a gap between the incumbent EPM solutions that customers are using and those newer applications or platforms that are available in the space. So it's with that agenda and the horizon we're looking at with SAP BPC that we felt it was worthwhile us inviting Simon to spend the afternoon with us and discuss his thoughts on an SAP roadmap. So without further ado, if I just introduce you, Simon. Simon and I worked together many moons ago when we both worked at Hyperion. That's where we first started our working life in the EPM space. And Simon, as Carrie's touched on, has spent the last 15 years building successful SAP practices and acting as an advisor to many organizations such as yourselves. So Simon, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Carrie. That's really interesting to hear about Concentric, and I know from other conversations about the work you've been doing with your customers and how they've helped them, how you've helped them, and certainly hearing about what you're doing now and capabilities that the business has. You know, it's with regard to BPC users, we're thinking about how important it is not just to be able to support them on an ongoing basis, but with some of the stories you've been able to relate to talking about how to help them when they're looking at migrating away. And, you know, whatever those journeys those customers on, having that BPC and SAP experience alongside the other EPM experience is really really important.
No, absolutely. And I think from our perspective, I think as with any change in technology or any pending change in technology, there are a multitude of factors to consider. And hopefully, as we go through this afternoon's presentation, some of that will become apparent. If we move to our first slide, I think the information on this table is probably relatively widely publicized. But before we get into the main discussion around it, can I just ask you to review the status of the various BPC versions? I think with some of those end dates moving over time, there has been a degree of uncertainty and confusion around what is what.
Yeah. So, and I think it's right. I think the information here is pretty much well known. I'm not sure a great deal has changed since the last time I presented one of these BPC roadmap webinars when I was still with Opal Wave, but the dates have changed over time. In some cases, you know, we're talking about from the Microsoft version, the end of maintenance date has been pushed from one decade to another. But we see that actually, even regardless of the version that you're on, we've clearly got the end of maintenance cliff edge for the Microsoft and NetWeaver users, if there are any of those on the call. But even with the BPC version 11, or as it's now in the latest release, version 2021, and the pending 2025 release, we see that the consequences of SAP's failure to deliver any enhancements into any version of BPC has left those solutions really trapped in time. And some of these, you know, we're talking about over 10 years since there's been a genuine enhancement in any version of BPC, other than through SAC, which actually involves purchasing an additional piece of software. So when we look at it in that context, every single piece of additional functionality coming out of SAP is not actually in BPC. And that's a a basically embedded truth within that solution. And we do see, even historically, there were functionalities that have been taken out, and again with the pending release of 2025, there's further functionality being deprecated. So the embedded capabilities will be removed, and that reverts back to a BW4 functionality going forward. So that's the high level on the dates and the versioning. As of now, we see the 2023 release as a technical component to enable BPC to operate with the BW4 version 2023. There's no material change in that.
Thank you for that. So I'm just looking at attendees, and I think we've got nearly 60 odd people on the call, which is encouraging. Just as out of interest, we wanted to throw up a poll just to get a feel for priorities on the call, for that matter. Carrie, I don't know if you can share that on the screen, and if we can ask you guys to just share your interest in BPC.
Yeah, I think we'll give everyone a minute, just further comment on the maintenance and the changes to SAP. That's actually spilled over into some of the pricing. So, for instance, edge pricing, which was available for mid-market customers, is no longer available at all, and that hasn't been for a while. The PMC, which is the old partner managed cloud, which enabled people to benefit from BPC on a subscription basis, is no longer available, and things like that. So maybe that's given a chance for everyone to respond. I don't know if you can put the results up and we can see who we've got. Yeah, actually, I'd say the biggest surprise there is potentially the number of BPC Microsoft users on the call, but certainly NetWeaver, BW4 HANA, and consultants, I would certainly expect to see the majority of people, which I think there are in those categories. I think we must be very interesting to have brought along an audience who's just interested.
So if I can just bring it back to one of the points you made a moment ago, Simon, I think in respect of SAP's ongoing support for BPC, if I draw a sort of industry comparison or industry term, does that mean that SAP are just committed to providing what I call sustaining support? In other words, maintaining existing versions and functionality for existing customers, or where does that stand?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, and I think that's a technical definition out of the Oracle world, that's sustaining support. But basically, anyone with BPC today is probably already come to terms with the fact that it's as good as it gets and potentially might get worse. But SAP are not going to deliver anything new into BPC, and obviously that's continually and increasingly putting people who are using BPC at a disadvantage in potentially cost of use and inability to benefit from new capabilities that are being deployed routinely now into competitive solutions. And you see some of the advances, especially in the AI and machine learning arenas, which whilst we've not seen huge adoption yet, the rate of adoption in other domains where we've seen AI and capabilities absolutely transforming what people do over a very short period of time, I think, along the way. And people trapped on BPC may well be running the risk of missing out on that sort of capability. And those really are the things that are driving people to talk to ourselves. And we've been helping people answer the questions, well, what does that mean to me? And when and asking the questions, when they're talking to their SAP account managers, and their account managers don't really understand EPM or CPM and the landscape, and are simply saying, well, just buy SAC or just buy group reporting. And maybe they're just saying, well, if you're not S4 HANA, use the SAC consolidation extension, which they're promoting, and obviously you're very familiar with that through Insight Cubes. So yeah, that I would say is a very fair summary.
Yeah, so I think just picking up on that for a second, for those customers with a SAP platform and an SAP EPM strategy, our Insight Cubes Europe business can help them run a consolidation in a SAP SAC environment, particularly where you've got what I call a hybrid or two-tier ERP setup, where you might have S4 HANA in the cloud alongside HANA in an on-premise environment or ECC, which would not work with group reporting. So I think if we just move on here, if you're looking at your SAP strategy and keeping in mind what you've just been explaining, Simon, what's the consequence of SAP's end of maintenance dates?
Well, I mean, clearly, if you're on one of the Microsoft or NetWeaver version, you are facing a cliff edge, and that's a fact. And you would have to come to terms with the consequences of working with out of maintenance software. But I think it's more than just those direct consequences. And I think there's many factors playing into what's happening. But ultimately, I think SAP themselves have forced every business to take a look at what their situation is and decide if they have a problem or not. It's not BPC being in the maintenance or not having new functionality may not be an issue, but I think it probably shouldn't be an accident for you to get to a situation where you're using a solution that may or may not impact your ability to operate. So I think we've been helping customers over the last year, just thinking about the future strategy and the consequences in their context, and think about the questions in their context as to what they should be doing next.
So I think we can clearly see that everyone running SAP BPC has a decision to make. It's either do nothing or do something. If you reflect on some of those customers that you're referring to, how have you helped them frame their choices?
Well, in reality, you're right. You've said you can make no decision, stay where you are, or you can consider alternate solutions. And I think that starting point is to understand what the options are. And certainly we think about if we wish to remain on BPC, we'll call it sweating the asset, because I think that probably is a good description of that decision as there is. But if BPC is meeting your current needs, the performance of the solution is acceptable, we may not actually have any challenge at all with that. Sometimes we can say that within a business there are just other priorities. We haven't got the time or the capacity, internal resources, or wherewithal to focus on this because we've got other bigger challenges, and therefore those things will take priority. We have to address the fact that if we go out of maintenance, we may be hitting a governance question, and therefore, depending on your version, this may not be an option. But then there's also that question of if we're living with that solution, and this one gets a little bit more complex to answer, but have we actually got the ability to continue living with it in terms of having the right support arrangements in place, both internally and potentially externally? So those are the kinds of questions that we think about having to address to to be able to really say, yes, we're comfortable in staying as we are with BPC. But then we also think about if the answer to any of those is no or becomes a problem, what else can we do? And then we've really got, that situation where maybe my business needs have changed, or we must move for one reason or another, and therefore we're sat with broadly speaking two alternatives. We can either stay with SAP, and in that scenario we're talking about an SAP Analytics Cloud or group reporting evolution, or we're talking about thinking of alternate technologies. And of course, either of these could be valid, but it will depend on your circumstances. And I think those are where we start to also see the further confusion in the market about, well, how do we make those decisions? And that again is not a light question, but in reality there's kind of some very simple markers for it. So for example, if you are a business that has committed to S4HANA and have a single instance of S4HANA, and all of our infrastructure is in SAP, then almost certainly you're going to be thinking about group reporting and SAC as fairly obvious choices. But if you're in a heterogeneous landscape, and that might extend even to just being a two-tier ERP with some S4HANA Cloud and S4HANA on Rise, but maybe also, we think about the other SAP ERPs, BYD and B1s, but then beyond that, we may have entities with Sun or Dynamics or all sorts of other ERPs feeding into our landscape. And then it becomes very much more difficult to say that SAP can actually address or answer, because certainly from a group reporting perspective, as soon as we're outside of that single instance of S4, we're starting to present ourselves with some challenges. And then there's more broad questions around, do we have a preference for siloed planning specialist capabilities and consolidation specialist capabilities, or do we look at that world of EPM or CPM in a unified perspective and are thinking about that kind of end-to-end cycle within a single technology? So again, questions around those things. But I think before we even get there, we've got to consider how do we answer the question as to whether we need to make any movement or choice at all.
So I think the obvious thing to say at this point is that in putting ourselves in a customer's shoes, if you're going to your management with a view on which direction you take, we need some anchor points to actually act as the cornerstone of a business case. And I know you've done some work around that in terms of similar to ourselves around better business case frameworks. Do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and this is actually an example from an exercise that we've been doing with one of our customers about exactly that, answering those sorts of questions. And we have framed it in, and I know you've referenced the better business case example of a framework very similar in reality. But we've got a number of factors that we think about, and those have detail behind them that impact on businesses in different ways. But they do fall into those categories of strategic, operational, financial, and management issues for a business. And like I say, we've been working with customers, and this is obviously can't name them, but a high-level conclusional piece of analysis from one of those.
Sure. So if we take each one of those framework elements in turn, clearly there are strategic matters such as technology gaps that we talked to earlier, or perhaps the trend towards use of more recent technologies such as AI, as well as the usual corporate governance, compliance, IT strategy implications. What are your observations?
Well, yeah, so if we do start on that kind of strategic perspective, clearly there are some really important factors that come into play, and mentioned how dramatic the impact of AI adoption has been in certain areas, and we see the likelihood of that accelerating in the CPM space. You start looking at how machine learning is delivering massive transformations in the efficiency of our integrations. We're seeing how AI is supporting us in eliminating human bias from our forecasting, and we've got statistical evidence showing people are improving forecast accuracy by as much as 25% just by adopting some AI support in those processes, and those are delivering us significant corporate benefits, and those are on the tables at the very top level in businesses today. But we also start looking at the whole governance agenda. And now we're talking about defense. So you've got that protect my business. We've seen examples of malicious actors, be they external state-sponsored organizations or be they commercially motivated ransomware attacks. We're seeing those things increasingly being targeted at customers. And the fact of the matter is, we have to be in a position, and this is absolutely an imperative at the top level in many organizations. We have to be in a position to defend our organizations, and therefore having that capability in a platform that is modern and up to date is becoming an imperative from that perspective.
So I think all of those factors are important, but I think it highlights that those that are technology driven perhaps just bring into focus the deficit between older solutions and those of current generation applications in terms of the features, capabilities, security and compliance capabilities of those technologies. If we move on to the next column on your graphic and actually look at some of the operational considerations, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, and we'll start to see as we go through this. Some of these questions actually are factors in different perspectives here. So, even operationally, as we start thinking about those new features and capabilities, it's simply about efficiency. It's simply about delivering to our users capabilities that are helping them in their day-to-day lives. Automations are becoming prevalent in so many of the things that we are doing in our processes, and strong process support that guides our users in a way that in some regards BPC users have had an element of, but in a lot of senses quite limited. We jump down to, does the system even address our needs? And that has consequences in all sorts of different ways. If it does address our needs, great. But if it doesn't address our needs, then we have to think about what we do to change our system, or our business isn't even going to be able to keep up with what our internal demands are. But even if the business is meeting our current needs, does it perform? And that's actually an important question. And we've seen over the years a lot of organizations struggling with their system, just not delivering the performance that business users expect. And that's a combination, could be a combination of many things. You can put the roots of those down to original design and implementation, through to infrastructure, through to networks, through to a variety of factors. And it does vary by customer, but it is not unusual. And I was in a workshop probably as little as 2 to 3 years ago, where we're talking to a customer who was looking at actually enhancing some functionality. And we got into the workshop, and it actually turned out that their business users were suffering from quite serious performance challenges, but they weren't aware at the center, because they hadn't actually done any exercises of checking that out. And whilst they start talking about the additional capabilities they were wanting to deploy, they actually suddenly found that a far bigger impact on the business was going to be address those system performance issues. Now we wind the clock on 3 years and we go, if we're in that same conversation, would it be worth the effort and the cost to address those, given everything else that's going on? In terms of the technology deficits and other factors.
So I think I was going to say, from surely though, that there's a broader issue there as well, in terms of the tenure of some of those staff that have got skills in that domain.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where we come to these final 2 points in reality, and these are actually becoming significant factors for people, depending on their internal capabilities and resources, and the tenure of those. And again, I've seen examples in the not distant past where staff have gone off with long-term health issues, or we've had some customers I'm aware of where there's been a retirement. And suddenly we're in that challenging position. If we want to go out to the market and find an additional resource who can come in and support and manage our internal BPC system, it's increasingly difficult to find anybody with those skills available. And equally, the consultancies that are providing functional and support services are finding exactly the same challenge. So you can't even as easily go to the market and say, I need some help from the market, buy in a consultant to address a gap in our internal capacity. And of course, the reasons for that are actually the same thing. So the consultancies are challenged. They can't recruit people to work on BPC because all of the people who are in that SAP world are merrily running away and doing SAC, group reporting, all those modern things, as you would. People want to be working with the latest technologies, and consultants certainly don't want to be pigeonholed in being the resource that is simply maintaining that old technology. They run after those shiny new things. And similarly, as an employer, you're trying to retain your staff, but when we start placing them in roles that are a piece of old technology, which is potentially going to reduce the value of their CV to a future employer, is that going to be something that potentially challenges their desire to remain in post and starts to give us our own retention challenges as well?
So I think the point I was trying to make, or really put across there, is that when you're considering the factors that add up into what we would consider a business case around a case for change, you also have to consider not just the feature function capabilities of a solution, but also, in this case, potentially the impact on cost of ownership in respect of that sort of diminishing pool of skilled resources, which impacts not just our ability but also a client's ability to execute with the existing teams and to provide that ongoing support. And I think that's something that quite often doesn't get said. So let's move on now, though. I'm just conscious of time. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the financial implications.
And again, everything costs money. So whether we're using an old system or a new system or anything, but when we're thinking about this specifically in the context of BPC and where BPC is, we have to ask that question. If the system is not addressing our current need and we're going to have to spend some money on it, I think there is a very, very simple question, and that is it worth spending it and investing further in BPC, or is it better to save that money and invest it in something new that will last us for longer into the future? But I think there's also that whole factor of the SAP cost itself, and that's not just a software cost. So yes, you've got the maintenance fee, and that maintenance fee is not insignificant for most customers. But it's not paying for enhancements. It's simply paying for us to stay where we are. We typically expect a portion of that money that we're paying in maintenance to be invested by the vendor in new features and functionality, but it's not. It's being invested in other products that we're going to have to pay more money or buy. But again, it's even more than that. So we may be sitting in an organization that's growing or changing, and we need to get some new users. Well, buying new users for BPC itself is no longer a simple thing. Depending on the version we're on, we may not even find that our product is on a price list anymore. And therefore, we haven't got access to even being able to buy more users. But also, there's a challenge that having retired the mid-market pricing, we're potentially unable to access the sorts of levels of discounts that we have historically, and additional users are significantly more expensive than they were. So there's a number of factors going into there, yeah.
So I think the summary there is there's a cost of doing nothing, is what you're trying to say, and that has to be stacked against the opportunity cost of change. Let's look at the final column on your graphic, which takes us into management implications.
Yeah, and again, it's spanning the same sorts of areas. So and again, some of these actually are almost hidden. So if we think about that whole IT support function within our business, we have our BPC system. It's running on an old platform technology that hasn't kept up with the rest of our organization. And we're having to sit there with some potentially dedicated IT resource just to keep the lights on. That resource is potentially becoming exactly the same as it is with BPC itself, more difficult to recruit, because it's a diminishing pool while everyone again moves to the most recent versions of everything and leaves these old things behind. But this is a business critical system. We can't afford it for the lights to go out, and therefore IT has to provide that support. That support is potentially an expensive doubling of things that we'd normally be doing once, but now we have to do in two different sets of technologies, and that has all of its comparable challenges. And of course, if we are sitting on those older platforms, that whole security question becomes more and more relevant as we're living in a world that isn't getting the same kind of attention to protect us. And then we think about, again, that business need question, even questions as simple as, well, we've added a new product line, we need to get some additional reporting to be able to analyze that, or we just want something extra that comes in through those routine business requests to do things in our in our monthly, quarterly internal application release cycles, and we suddenly find that because our capacity internally is going down to is being reduced in terms of supporting that kind of enhancement, that we're starting to become less and less able to support the business on that BAU basis, and starting to grow that continued dissatisfaction. And of course, that continued dissatisfaction or growing dissatisfaction plays into the whole atmosphere within businesses, and again that challenge that we get with our retention and staff morale and skills and things like that we have to at a practical level address. And of course, we know that it's getting harder and harder to find those support services. We've even seen firms discontinuing those support services, and were left as a customer without a supplier at all, and going out to the market to try and find a new one. And we may well be finding that's even less attractive commercially, and potentially less attractive from a capability perspective than what we've had before. So again, at that kind of operational level, and we see a lot of challenges. And I guess we put all of that together, and I think back over the last 5, 6, 7 or more years, and have worked with a lot of customers who've gone through exercises like this to look at, should we upgrade our BPC? Should we go to market and choose something different? And I think one of the conclusions one of the changes that we see is, I think in that 5, 6 year ago timeline, the majority of customers, not all, but the majority would be saying, yes, we should upgrade to the next version of BPC.
So I think we probably just need to be conscious of time now. I think from I'm also starting to wonder how I pull this together into a viable summary, because I said I'd do that at the end. So I think if I try and wrap this up, so I think, first of all, Simon, really appreciate your input here. I couldn't begin to explain what you've just outlined. It's been a very helpful session. If I can try and summarize your guidance, I think the following are the key takeaways for this session. So first of all, SAP aren't investing in the software anymore, but existing customers are still being asked to pay for ongoing support. SAP is encouraging migrations to SAC or group reporting, but but helpful information isn't that forthcoming. And what we were talking about a moment ago around the technology piece and the shift into that gap in technology between old and new, businesses are being left with that technical deficit and a dependency in some cases on less than optimal process, maybe, that could impact on things like competitiveness or that cost of ownership that I talked to earlier. And then the obvious point is BPC customers need to make a decision. So I think that the summary is what's right for each individual customer is going to differ dependent on your individual circumstances. A do-nothing strategy doesn't come for free, I think, is your point. You can replace BPC with an alternative SAP solution, or you could look to replace BPC with a non-SAP alternative. So when making those choices, I think the point I was trying to put across here is that I think you don't buy this technology as something that is going to last 2 or 3 years. You're investing in it with the expectation that there's going to be a 5 to 10 year useful life. And that being the case, we collectively encourage you to think about how do you frame that business case? What are the factors that you need to pull together to actually help you make sense of the right choice? So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much, Simon, and thank you all very much for your time and attention. Carrie, can I just ask if we've had any questions and hand off to yourself?
Yes, we have had a few questions. we've had some sent to us ahead of the event, and I can also see some in the ones in the chat. So I'll answer the ones in the chat first. So the first question, what do you think is SAP's endgame by not supporting BPC?
Well, I think SAP has clearly decided it doesn't care about BPC, and it's not supporting that question, that solution in any sense. I've heard instances of that question being asked directly to senior SAP management, and the response has been, well, why aren't you using SAC now? And I think that really is, I think that is an SAP behavior. I've heard similar things when people have asked the question, well, what if my platform of choice is Microsoft SQL, and you get that blank expression from the SAP management that says, well, surely you use NetWeaver. There is no other alternative. And frankly, from the SAP perspective, it is such a small part of their business. It's a distraction, and they just don't want people on it. They are proactively wanting people to move to one of their new solutions, and if you don't move to one of their new solutions, I'm not even sure they care.
Great, thank you. And the second question, is SAP still upgrading the EPM add-in, which we use with BPC, with new functionality, or is it just being maintained?
No, the EPM add-in is sitting side by side with BPC. It will ultimately vanish with BPC. It's not going to be, there's nothing new going into that. It's not being enhanced. SAC, for example, has a new Excel client, in my opinion, nowhere near as good as the EPM add-in. It is a big shame that will retire with BPC, but again, it sits very firmly with that BPC world and not with the SAP other solutions world, for which they've got alternative options.
Okay, thank you. And the third question, how is BPC 10.1 NetWeaver at risk from ransomware attacks?
To be honest, in exactly the same way as anything else. It's BPC 10.1, obviously sitting on NetWeaver. So we see the SAP world pivoting to BW4, and that's where all of SAP's investment is going. You're probably lucky to be 10.1 NetWeaver and not 10.1 Microsoft. 10.1 Microsoft is clearly sitting on out of support versions of Windows platform already, and therefore the risks are dramatically rising. At least the BPC 10.1 NetWeaver is still set on NetWeaver, and therefore that is still a maintained platform, and therefore SAP are still taking that very seriously. Move forward to 2027 when that goes out of maintenance or goes into extended maintenance, then you've got a 3-year period where you'll pay more money, but you'll have some certainly strong attention from SAP in that period, because they know that they've got a commitment to doing that. But then I think beyond 2030, and you're in the same boat as BPC Microsoft users remaining are today, and that is I would suggest a fairly scary position.
And is BPC mainly being replaced by SAP products or by products for the vendors?
Again, that's a very mixed bag. Probably in volume terms, I would say the trend is to other vendors.
Is it probably worth saying though that I think those customers that are sitting on SAP ERP can be differentiated from those that are not, and I think there's a difference in the stats when you compare those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the biggest single differentiating factor. It's what is your organization's SAP strategy? We know that you look at certain organizations and they are absolutely committed to SAP. They will adopt the SAP technology simply because that is their strategic position. And that strategic position has them migrating to S/4HANA, and that is adopted throughout the entire organization as much as any organization can adopt anything throughout its entirety. But I would probably go a rule of thumb metric just as a differentiation. If you're more than 70% within a single instance of SAP S/4HANA, then you'll probably strongly consider group reporting. If you have less than that, you'll probably strongly trend towards a non-SAP alternative. And that's for the group reporting side. It's maybe less a clear cut on the SAC side, because SAC is not quite so tied. Well, SAC is not tied to the S4 platform in the way that group reporting is. Group reporting is basically a module within the S4 ledgers.
And somebody's asked, what would be the best non-SAP to replace BPC? You mean best solution?
How long have you got?
Well, I'll not let David answer that question because, but the reality is it depends. You've got to look at your circumstances. So you may have a desire for a unified platform, which may drive you towards something like a one stream. You may have a preference for a modular approach, which may drive you towards, say, an Anaplan, and obviously they've just acquired a consolidation capability themselves. So you may even have some technology from another vendor which you already have embedded in your business and like, and that can be influencing that decision. But there's a lot of competent products out there in all sorts of different ways. If you're strongly Oracle based in terms of ERP, you've got exactly the same question as you would have as if you were SAP. If you're strongly Oracle based, you probably would consider the Oracle EPM solutions. And again, then you start thinking about complexity and scale of the business. So you look at the mid-market, there's alternate solutions which potentially, such as the LucaNets, where you have some advantages. So it absolutely depends on where you sit in the market and what your particular preferences and requirements are.
I think the only one point I will say is, if you're moving, and we didn't necessarily say this clearly in the discussion we had earlier, if you're moving purely to get off a piece of technology because it's out of support, then you're not necessarily stepping back and considering in what way can we benefit the organization by moving to another technology. And often as not, that becomes less about the technology itself and more about the process benefit that you want to introduce by moving to a more modern platform of some form. And that I think is a telling difference between, is that technology deficit that we talked about earlier. I think it's about what are your what are the advantages of moving to some of that technology, and does that matter to you? Because if you're looking to just do a technology shift from one to another, and you just want to be on a supported product because IT are shouting at you saying, we're out of support, that isn't necessarily you stepping back and saying, how can we make the lives of our users better? Or how can we streamline the process and take advantage of a more integrated or unified approach?
Okay, we do have quite a specific question. If a customer has both S/4HANA and BW4HANA, should they go to BPC for BW4 or BPC for S4?
Okay, that is a specific question, and the answer to that is it depends where they're coming from. I'm assuming they've got BPC deployed. If they've got BPC deployed, then it depends how that BPC is deployed today. If your BPC is deployed on the embedded model, then you would go to the BPC for S4, and that's because that technology is effectively the evolution of that same technology. If you have a BPC deployment that is classic deployment, so it's the multi-dimensional model in BPC as is traditionally deployed, free that embedded or instead of that embedded alternative, then you would go to BPC for BW4. And in both of those cases, clearly there are the same considerations as to whether those are the right solutions for you. Because if you're deployed S4, would the question not actually be, should we go to group reporting and SAC rather than go to BPC for BW4 or for BPC for S4? So those are maybe the things I would frame in that. So I would look to challenge the premise that we'd want to go to BPC at all, and ask the question, should we not be thinking about group reporting and SAC?
Great, thank you, Simon. We just have one more. Doesn't SAP BPC 2021 offer new features or functionalities?
No.
No.
And it's as simple as that.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's all the questions we've had today. Thank you to everyone for attending. We really appreciate your time and your attention. We've had a couple of people ask about a copy of the slides. The link to the recording and the slides will be made available shortly over the coming days. So please feel free to share with anyone else you might think will be interested as well. If you do have any further questions for Simon and David, please feel free to reach out to us directly using the contact details, which will be on screen on the next slide, please, Simon. We have also just published details of our next webinar in this series as well, which will be exploring some lessons learned from our BPC migrations to date, which you may find interesting. That will be held towards the end of June. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.